welcome to the show. I'm just thrilled that you are here and we get to talk to you.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Me too. Every time we have a conversation, whether it's in a coffee shop real quick on the way to another place, or whether it's at your conference, or whether it's over email or LinkedIn, it's always such a great conversation. And I'm really looking forward to today.
I love talking to you, Yulia, so I know we're going to have fun. And I cannot wait to hear what questions you have ready. There's so much to say these days.
There's a lot to say, and I can't wait to hear your reaction about some of them, honestly. But first, your book, Wonder Woman, How to Reclaim Your Space, Find Your Voice, and Travel the World. It just came out in March of this year. So before we go any further, huge congratulations to you for such a beautiful book out in the world now.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been like such a labor of love, and I just love seeing it, and I love seeing people reading it, and it's like the biggest compliment, and I just hope that it can inspire whether that next generation of traveler or help people who have traveled their whole lives to just think about their travels differently.
Yeah. And as I'm reading it, I'm about halfway through it, I realized something. It is written in such a beautiful and powerful voice, and I've always known you wearing many different hats. You're an entrepreneur, you're a community builder, you're an incredible advocate for women. But now I also know that you're an amazing, amazing writer. Like, just the voice that's jumping out on the page is so beautiful. It's really a treat to be reading it. So congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Thanks.
May I ask you to read us an excerpt from the book? And perhaps let's start at the very beginning, the introduction to the book.
Yeah, let's do that. So I've got my own copy here. And thanks for asking. I don't actually get a lot of opportunities to read my own book. So it's always really fun actually to do it. And I hope that this can give everybody just a little bit of a taste of what the book is like, and to your point, what the voice is like, and what people get out of it. So we're going to read the introduction. It's called So You Want to Travel. And every chapter starts with a quote. This one is from Helen Keller, which is, life is either a daring adventure or nothing. If you had told me back in 2009, when I took one of my first solo trips, that women were the majority of travelers and commanding 80 to 85% of consumer travel decisions, or that women had been traveling alone and mostly successfully since 8400, I wouldn't have believed you. How could I? I was living overseas in a small country called Sao Tome and Principe, a two-island nation off the coast of Gabon in West Africa. I would wake up in the morning and sweep tiny crabs out of my bathroom that had crawled into the house from the ocean while I was sleeping. I would ride my motorcycle to school past the amused shouts of neighbors, teasing me with the town joke that I was the lone female motorcycle taxi driver. Truth be told, I could barely start and stop the thing, let alone carry another person with me. I was one of 4 known Americans living in the country at the time. And while I was immersed in new information about other people's worldviews, I was still trying to identify my own. Living abroad was an amazing experience. It was also lonely. I didn't fit conventional expectations of women where I was living, especially in how I dressed, how I acted, and how I spent my time, so I didn't have a lot of female friends. It was one of the first times I had realized how different women's experiences abroad actually were. And when I say different, I don't necessarily mean different from men's or even different from our experiences in our home countries. I mean different from every other place we visit as women. Each place we go has a new set of structural norms, cultural nuances, and gender expectations that we must adapt to and learn. More inside.
Beautiful. Beautifully said. And I thought it's such a wonderful way to start this conversation, because in that 2 paragraphs that you just read, it sort of gives you a sense of what the book will be, because there are stories that you share from your own life that we're going to go deeper into in the conversation today, interspersed with some really thoughtful and almost like philosophical, but also energetic and inspiring, almost like manifesto-like thoughts on, us reclaiming our space in the world, and also stories and insights from other women who are leading in different ways in the travel community. So I just absolutely loved it. But I want to ask you, what do you love about this book?
I appreciate all the things you're saying. And I think it's so funny that a couple people now have said to me, like, this book is a philosophical book. And I was like, you know what? I like that description of this book. It's that too. It has always been really hard to describe this book for people because, and a lot of people have said it's kind of like a style they've never really seen before. And it's a travel book. And in some ways it's a travel guide. But like you were saying, Yulia, it's also a manifesto. It actually fits into a self-help category. Like if you read a lot of self-help books, that's the style. It's written to the reader. It's given like real true life stories. It's bringing in perspectives from experts and it's talking about hard topics, but it's doing it in a travel context and lens. And it's doing it very intentionally toward women who I think really need this message, who haven't actually been seated down with and talked about what it's like to go out into the world. And so I think for me, the thing that I like the most is I think I'm just proud of myself that I got it all down. Honestly, like I think that's what it is. It is a monumental task to write a book. And I knew that from the beginning. And I never actually, I didn't wake up when I was 5 years old and say, I want to write a book someday. That was never me. And I think throughout my life, I kind of wondered, like, do I even have enough in my brain to like write a book? Like a book is a lot. There's a lot of information there. And I really thank my editor. I kind of wrote the first chapter and I was thinking, no, I do have a lot to say. And my editor really helped tease some of that out of me. And I realized how much I did have a book inside of me. And so I just love how it turned out. I love the flow of it. And I'm hoping that it is that message that I hope more women receive, because there's not enough information out there that's helping us, like real helpful, genuine information. And I wanted a book that gave that, but also gave it in a very loving and humorous and interesting and inspiring light.
Yeah, you're funny. I laughed a couple of times while reading some of the stories, And like you said, I haven't seen a book like that out there, especially in the travel space, because it's just such a beautiful example of your whole philosophy and your whole work, almost, your body of work that you've produced over the years. But you said something how it's so difficult to write a book. It's such a monumental challenge. And will I have enough? Well, that's one of the things that I also struggle with, because I have aspirations to write a book. And you've been one of the people who's been nudging me towards that. But that's one of the things that I have is like, do I have enough to say for a whole book? I read in the book itself that even the way you wrote it, it coincided with your journey to motherhood in a way, because you started writing this book when you were pregnant with your first daughter. You made a lot of progress on it when you were pregnant with your second one, and you were finishing it when you were pregnant with your son, which is such a beautiful allegory for the journey of this book itself. How did you know that, okay, I do have enough to say? So was it really like your editor who was pivotal in that realization?
I think so. So my editor didn't come along, of course, until later. Like there was a certain point of time where I went, okay, I'm going to write a chapter. I'm going to send it to a publisher, or I'm going to send it to an agent, and then we're going to look for a publisher. When I first set out to write the book, it was more or less a solo female travel guide. That's kind of like how I had imagined it. And the introduction that I read for you, that was actually the first thing I wrote. So the very first thing I wrote, it's of course changed many times over, but it became what the introduction is today. I think I learned a lot about what was in my own mind going through an editorial process. And I think I really learned my voice in a lot of ways going through this process. And sometimes I think it just takes another person to give you that feedback, to be like you're saying, like, wow, you're actually really funny, or like, wow, you have some interesting insights on, how we should do this. And I think that's where it really took off. Like there was always going to be a book that provided real helpful support for women traveling alone. And I always wanted something that had a bit of what I like to call the sit down conversation. Like I compare it to like the birds and the bees conversation that your parents have with you. Like this is the conversation that I wish everyone were to have before they go on their first trip of here's what it's going to feel like. Here's what it's going to be like. So those tips were always in there. But then it was when we were pitching it to our editor, and she was an avid solo traveler herself. And she was saying, we're actually in the self-help imprint. And she's like, I would encourage you to lean more into the evergreen, lasting pieces of advice that you have versus here's what restaurant to go to and here's what thing, because that stuff is ephemeral. It's not going to last. And she's like, there's so many lessons that you already have inside you that are just lasting lessons that you can literally pass on to generations. And let's focus on that. And so that's kind of where this book came from. It has a lot of tips, as you said, but a lot of those tips are very evergreen tips that will just last and last and last. And my hope is that this book is something that I wrote it as a book that's gifted. Like, I actually wrote it as a book that, if you know somebody who's traveling alone, who's maybe preparing for studying abroad or just retired or something, you can actually gift them this book and say, I love travel. It's changed me. It's changed my life. There's so many things I didn't know when I first started out. This book is going to give you so much of that, and just read it and it's going to help you. And like, that was kind of the scenario that I imagined for this. And I think that has always gone on from the beginning, but everything else has evolved.
And I resonate with what you said about the editorial process, because even in the article writing world, it's the same. I actually love that process of working with an editor, because inevitably they make your pieces so much stronger. So that's second perspective.
So much better.
Is super valuable.
And I mean, the question of, do you have a book inside you? First of all, Yulia, you have like 10 books inside you. So for sure. But also, I think it's a valid question, because this topic of like positioning ourselves in certain ways, that's not something that like an average person thinks about all the time. As an entrepreneur, you sort of think about, okay, well, what are people looking to me for? And what's the advice that kind of separates me from other people? But when you're just you're not really thinking outside yourself that often. And so sometimes you don't really think like, well, how much do I know? I mean, a book is like a lot. When you get that external feedback, and then you start, like, I literally started jotting down the chapters and building it. And like, the more I started writing down, the more I was like, oh, and I want to talk about this. Oh, and this. And then my editor would be like, well, what about this? And I was like, yes, we should also talk about that too. And then it would compile, and then we were cutting things out, So I think you don't realize how much you know until you start writing, and then you kind of surprise yourself.
I love that. I love that so much. So let's get into some of the chapters, because I really wanted to discuss some of the things I read in here with you, almost like a mini book club today.
Yeah.
In chapter 1, you say, fact, you can be a tourist and a traveler. And I loved that section so much, because I actually very much believed, and I think you say that you also used to hold that kind of idea that there's even like some bags or some t-shirts that say be a traveler, not a tourist. And I used to own one for sure.
Yeah.
And my thinking has evolved on this, and I sense that yours has as well. So talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, I think for a long time, it was the source of pride to be able to say, I'm a traveler, I'm not a tourist. And what is a tourist? They're going to like all the tourist traps, eating crappy dinner at like super touristy. Right? Yeah. They're going to the Eiffel Tower. They're wearing like white sneakers. I don't know. And I always thought of myself as like enlightened, globally aware citizen, like, oh, I'm a traveler. And you know what? I've shifted in my mindset. I think because, first of all, you're such a jerk to say that, like to other people, to be like, oh, I'm so much more enlightened than you. Like, what does that actually mean? How do you know that? You don't know somebody else's life. That's very presumptuous, first of all. But second of all, I think that the more I've traveled, the more I realize actually how travel is not about where you go so much as the muscles that you exercise in questioning the world around you, in trying new things, in opening yourself up to people's experiences, to letting the world be as much a part of you as you are a part of it. And because of that, I also believe that travel is not dependent on how many miles you go, that there are people out there who have traveled thousands and thousands of miles and probably have not really traveled much at all, because maybe they never thought to question the way they see the world. Even though they went to all these amazing places, they were just kind of like inside their own mindset, staying at a hotel that looked like any other hotel, not really venturing out and trying anything new. So I think that, to kind of like tee us up here, I think that this concept of what is travel starts to make us really question, what are the things that you're doing in order to make a travel experience happen? And then let's also talk about the fact that the act of traveling itself is a muscle. And as you exercise that muscle, finding that discomfort is going to happen at different levels for different people. So if you've traveled a lot, you might have some, like, what I like to call pretty strong travel muscles. Maybe you're working this out more often. But if you've never traveled before, doing something that may just be like only ever so slightly different from your home experience, that still may be like a very monumental travel experience for you. And who are we to shun that? If you're stepping out of your comfort zone, like to this way extreme way for you, we should be congratulating each other on that. Like, way to go that you actually did something that made you really uncomfortable. And way to go that you're trying to see the world differently from somebody else's perspective. And it doesn't matter actually how far you went or how much of sitting on a hill in the middle of nowhere in Nepal for 6 weeks you did. If you go to a touristy restaurant in Paris and you feel fundamentally uncomfortable, you're trying something new and you're immersing yourself in the world, bravo to you. That's amazing. We should all try to do that no matter where we are. And I think that's where I started really changing my perspective on what travel is, how much we shame each other inherently about what travel is supposed to be, but also how a lot of that is based in spending a lot of money, traveling a lot of miles, having a lot of disposable time and income, and is completely off limits to so many people. And that makes it completely unfair.
I love the part in the book where you talked about these privileges that people have and how most of the world actually still even today is not able to afford even traveling because they're living on, I think your stat in the book was like $4 a day or something like that.
Yeah.
It's interesting for me. I started shifting my idea of this concept of traveler versus tourist actually last year when I guess it's time to make it official. I met someone and we started traveling together and we went to Budapest, and he's a very, very tourist oriented person. So he wants to hit all the spots. He wants to go to all the museums. And I'm not like that. I do travel differently. I'd rather, go somewhere small where there's not that many people, that not that many other tourists. But I gave in to his agenda for the trip, and I had so much fun in those museums, in those squares, on those two level buses that tourists take. Like, I had so much fun, and I was like, Yulia, why have you been so uptight about it? There's
Yeah.
different ways to travel, really, to your point,
Yeah.
and we're all on a
Yeah.
journey, and it can be
We're all on
beautiful.
a journey. I just was reading this book that it's about to come out. It's called The New Tourist by Paige McClanahan. She's a New York Times writer. And she referenced this billboard that I haven't seen, but it was up in the 90s, and it was over the highway, and it said, "You're not stuck in traffic. You are traffic." I think about that with tourism. You're not at a tourist trap. You are a tourist. You are part of the tourist experience that's happening here. It's not like you and a bunch of other tourists and tourist activities. Like, you are part of that, and it's okay to own that and to recognize that, because separating yourself out, saying like, oh, I'm a traveler, I'm super into the local stuff. And we all want to be good travelers, or we all should want to be good travelers anyway. But tourism is part of that. If you're not from that place, you are a tourist there, regardless of if you're doing the touristy activities or not. And trying to separate yourself from that, it almost separates yourself from the reality of the impact that you are generating, both negative and positive. You're kind of saying, well, I'm choosing to not be part of this tourist ecosystem. Well, you can't. You actually can't choose to not be part of the tourist ecosystem, because you are part of it. Yes, there are ways that you can travel better, but you are still going to be included in these last calculations of economic and social impact of tourism because you're a tourist.
In chapter 2, you start with a story of being interviewed for WBZ, which is the local NPR station here in Chicago. And Beth and I share this sort of tidbit that, I'm based in Chicago now. Beth used to live in Chicago and really loves this city. So we talked about that
love it.
In the past as well. But you were interviewed for WBZ in 2014, and the host asked you this absolutely ridiculous question. So, Beth, women in travel, huh? Is there a market for that? I love that section
It's
because
the
it's such a
market.
great illustration for the
Yeah.
whole issue and the whole challenge that you, again, have dedicated your whole life to.
Yeah. Well, and if people related to that, I think a lot of times when we're talking about the book, people say, and you said it so eloquently, the full title of the book is Wander Woman: How to Reclaim Your Space, Find Your Voice, and Travel the World Solo. And a lot of people will say to me, well, what does reclaim your space mean? Like, what is that part of this title? The thing that is just wild about all of this is that we talk about women in travel as if it's like the small niche of the travel industry. And you see that even if it's not explicitly said that way, it is very implicitly said in the articles we read. Ooh, the growing women in travel market. Oh, women-owned businesses has increased this percentage. The reality is that women in travel is the travel industry. It is the vast majority. It's 85% of travel decisions are made by women. Women are traveling by and large more than men. We're spending more money than men. We're traveling more frequently than men. There's more of us traveling. So we actually run the entire market. And what we should be doing is calling like the men in travel niche as a niche, because that's what it is. And so it still gets me sometimes when people say things like, oh, women in travel, like, what's that? Or, even solo female travel, which is, a smaller segment, but still like this huge growing thing, incredible amount of spend. We are the dominant majority market, but we're talked to and believed as if we are the niche. And that's represented in the marketing materials, in the way we talk about the space, in the amount of time and energy and dedication we put to this. And once you know the reality of it, it's absolutely mind-boggling. And I wanted to illustrate that point for an audience of travelers, for them to understand that when I was first traveling alone and I was living in Sao Tome, I felt like I was honestly the only person in the world doing it. Like, I really felt so by myself. Like, I just didn't know anybody else traveling the way that I was. And I think that we are still gaslighted to believe that. We're made to believe that if we're women who want to go out into the world, and especially on our own, that we are in the fierce minority. And there's not a lot of people doing it, and it's very dangerous, and you should be very careful, and it doesn't happen very often, and we need to check in on you. But actually, if you just know how pervasive it is and how many women are getting out there, I think it gives you a little bit more agency to say, I'm not going to be the first or the last. So what am I afraid of? I'm just going to go.
There's so much that's stirred in me, this conversation, because first of all, to your point, that we are the majority, but we don't see ourselves reflected in marketing and all these other things. And in leadership too, in the travel industry,
In
by and large,
leadership.
the leadership
Yep.
is, we are not represented there. It's changing now, but still we have a
Yep.
long way to go. And to your point about gaslighting, actually, I remember there was a period in my life, not so much anymore, maybe because I turned 40, so people gave up on me. But in my mid 30s, I really got these vibes that people thought I was selfish because
Mm-hmm.
instead of kind of building
Yep.
a family or getting focused on that, I was traveling. I was traveling.
Yep.
And even
Yep.
today, sometimes I get
Yeah.
that vibe that it's so
Yeah.
selfish for you to do that
Yeah.
as a woman. And it's that reclaiming your space part of it.
It's so aggravating how much of an expectation there is. And I feel like the next book I'm going to write is all about like doing this in the context of motherhood, because I think like as a mother, and you mentioned I have 3 kids, I've seen this happen. In fact, it was what incensed me to start Wanderful, and I tell that story in the book about reading this story of a woman who was a mother of 2 who was killed overseas. And the comment section was wild. It was like, oh, what kind of man would let his wife travel alone? And what kind of mother would leave her children? I couldn't believe that that's the thing that people were choosing to talk about when this woman was killed abroad, that they were like mom shaming her for. I was just like, first of all, knowing what happened, do you want her kids to be there? And second of all, like, why is it that when you become a mother, you're like tethered to your identity of motherhood, like as if you've completely lost everything else? And same with when a woman becomes a partner or a caregiver of any kind. I think it is absolutely absurd that we put these expectations on women. I haven't seen a single story yet about like a man killed abroad and then people saying like, well, what did his wife think about that? And like, what kind of father would leave their children and travel the world? Like, nobody puts that stuff there. So why are we talking to women like that?
It's that classical victim shaming, right? Which you talk about in the book as well
Absolutely.
with that
Yep.
example, which is just so frustrating.
Yes.
You have done so much work with Wanderful and with this book. And I also want to point out that you have a podcast that is dedicated to
Too.
this exact topic called 85% Podcast. So for our listeners, if you love podcasts and you love our podcast, I know you're going to love Beth's podcast as well, because she has really poignant and interesting conversations with women in travel. We're going to link to it. And I was actually a guest on Beth's podcast as well.
Yeah.
I loved it
First
so much.
season.
Yeah, exactly. First season, an episode called A Vessel for Their Stories, which I thought so beautiful. It's such a beautiful way to title it. And you also see some familiar faces on that podcast, because Lola Akinmate, who was a guest on my show, Jen Ruiz, who recently came on, Nara Rafael, who is coming on my podcast soon. All these women have joined Beth's podcast as well. So definitely check it out. It's a beautiful, beautiful body of work. You also talk about in the same chapter, in chapter 2, you tell a story of forgetting a swimsuit while going to Brazil. And
Yeah.
then going on the beach, and you're already in Brazil and you want to go to the beach and you're looking for a swimsuit, and you realize that all the swimsuits around you are teeny tiny thongs and bikinis, and you're like, oh my God, I cannot wear that. But then you go to the actual beach and you see that every body, and literally every body, and you put those in 2 words in the book, which I just absolutely love. Everybody is wearing those, and they're not ashamed of their bodies at all. And I love that story because it's such a powerful story.
I think it was my editor who, her friend was going to Brazil just after she read that, and she was like, go into the cabanas and tell me what it looks like in there. Like, they were all scoping it out, and you're like, oh my God, you're totally right. They all do look like that. That chapter is all about it starts with this funny story of me realizing that there's like old grandmas wearing thongs, which is a little bit upsetting as an American. And then you sort of realize, like, God, what a great world we live in. And it's a way of introducing a much broader concept, which is the beliefs we have about who can and should travel and who can and should travel alone. And it was a really special way to bring in some of the most interesting and diverse minds in the travel industry that I was able to interview and talk to, who are women who are community builders of their own, who want to see women be seen in their very different ways and their different intersections. And I think there is still this perspective of, you know, first off, that solo travelers are like white male silver foxes, which is basically like the only thing we see on travel TV. And if it's not that, if it is a woman, then it's like a 20-year-old young Western blonde woman, like sun-kissed with her hands in the air, like looking at a sunset. Yeah. And it's just, you know, and like no shame to anyone who fits into that description. But that's not the only person that's out there. And we have to show a much wider diversity of experiences, because if you're not showing that and you're not actively showing that, then you're creating this perception that it's never been done before. And that kind of goes into the last thing we talked about, which is just knowing how many people are out there is going to empower you, knowing that there are so many blind women out there, and women who use wheelchairs, and Black women, and women wearing hijab, and women of all different kinds of backgrounds and ages and ethnicities and religions and belief systems that are experiencing these things, then maybe you can too. And we have to start putting that into the mainstream conversation, that it is not just one type of person who travels. And doing that and saying that does not do justice for the rest of us. And so that was kind of like my introduction to understanding that being who you are in the body that you're in is, it's important to recognize that, and to also recognize that, and we go in a little bit of like body politics and size politics in that chapter, because we talk about how a lot of the times the things that we have to navigate, if you use a wheelchair, for example, and you're constantly navigating a city that's not built for you, it is not your fault. It is the city's fault. These are ways that we need to start thinking about this stuff, that these systems are failing us. We're not failing the systems. Everybody should be able to travel this world freely. The reality is that it's a lot harder for some than others, but that's not your fault. That's the system's fault.
I actually love that you pointed that out now, because I related to that one so much. That's concept of, we all are made to feel and believe that when we're not fitting in some shape or form into the structure, it's our fault that we're not fitting in.
Yeah.
And we're not, I think, brought up to really question those structures or rigorously think about
Yeah.
those structures. So I thought that was such a beautiful way to do that. And just to reiterate to our listeners that this is a just absolutely amazing book, and just the voice. Look. Your voice is so powerful and so lucid in it. I'm halfway through it. I can't wait to finish it, and we'll link to it in the show notes so you guys can all check it out. But I also want to talk to you next about how open and vulnerable you've been lately about different topics that are part of this book journey. You know, you've been very open about being an entrepreneur, about motherhood, and about this very book itself. And in your recent LinkedIn post, you said that there was so much care and so much attention and love and craft that went into this book. And I think you said something like you treated every word as if it was made of glass, and you expected a lot of things. Maybe people would come at you with, maybe some ideas would rouse some feathers or whatnot, but what you didn't expect was no response at all. And you proceeded talking about how in book publishing world, a 2-month-old book is considered to be an old news already, because the world moves so fast. And after your book tour, attention spans kind of go away. So I just really related to that, because one of the fears for me, and one of the reasons why I haven't done anything, in this ambitious way, is that I just feel like there's so much noise out there. And I'm not talking about your book, because there's so many amazing books out there, but there's just so much out there. And people, I feel like we're all in such a frenzy all the time. We're on overload with the things that come at us, that sometimes it just kind of gives me a pause and like, well, how do you break through in that? So I'm curious, how has your thinking evolved since you posted that? It's been maybe a few weeks since you posted that. And how do you think about that?
Thanks for bringing that up. It's been a very interesting journey, because let me first off say that I am endlessly proud of this book. I love it. I love how it's turned out. And I say that because I'm not always the one to like fiercely defend myself. I probably should do it more than I do, but sometimes I'm like, okay, I must be wrong, or I must not be very good at this, or whatever. But there's just this part of me, I just know it's a good book. I just know it. I believe in it. I want everybody to read it. I really do. I feel like even the people who don't think they should read it, because you're going to learn so much more. And I've also learned that, unfortunately, nowadays, the way publicity works is maybe the way it's always worked and I'm just learning, or maybe it's new, but there is so much involved with who you know. And let me explain this through, I read this book once that talked about the godmother complex, which is, I may have misnamed it, but it's something about the godmother, fairy godmother, something. And I still can't remember where I got this from, but it stayed with me for years and years. And basically the idea is that so many girls are told fairy tale stories. And in those stories, there's a lot wrong with fairy tales. But one of the things that's wrong with fairy tales is that 99% of the time, the main character of the fairy tale, especially in these princess stories, is like a young woman or a girl who's like an inherently good person. They're like a good person who's just down on their luck, but they're just going to keep being good. And then one day, some sort of fairy godmother or magical person sees them and sees what they do. And they say, okay, you have been good for long enough. Now I'm going to help you. And they get that pumpkin turned into a carriage, or they get the Prince Charming, or they get the whatever other thing, the magical ice powers, whatever. Like all of these women get these things that are gifted to them from some outside spirit or fairy godmother or mystical thing. And what happens is, I think a lot of girls, including me, are made to believe sometimes that all you have to do is like just do good work and be good. And if you're good enough, and if you believe in yourself enough, and then somebody's going to notice you and you're going to get what you deserve because you've been really good. And I actually think that that does a lot wrong to the girls in our world, because self-advocacy is a hugely important thing. You have to learn how to speak up for yourself, how to speak back for yourself, how to network and find opportunities and grab those opportunities and take them and use them. And I think sometimes we do a disservice in sort of downloading this belief that like, no, all I have to do is do good. And it's a very long and rambly way of explaining that even books, I think as an author, I have learned that it's a little bit sad, but it's also enlightening to know some of these books that are on bestseller lists. It's on a bestseller list because the author literally bought thousands of books for themselves just to increase the rank of the book so that it would show, because we know that once it's a bestseller, it gets opportunities and it gets publicity. And so it's this kind of backwards, but also very smart, but also way of engineering where you kind of think like all I have to do is just write a good book and magically everyone's going to read it. People are going to love it. It's going to go on bestseller lists. I just have to be a good writer. And it's actually not that at all. There's a ton of work that goes into the publicity and the promotion and the marketing and the sure believing in yourself. But I think for a first time publisher, that's something that hit me really hard. Was I was sort of expecting, I knew the book was good and I was sort of expecting people to just naturally talk about it and share it. And then it hasn't done badly. Like book sales have been good, but it hasn't been like the splash that I sort of expected it to be. I've also learned a ton, and I've learned lessons that are going to help me the second time around. And I think one of the best pieces of advice that I got was from somebody who I admire so much, Dr. Anu Taranath, and she is the writer of a book called Beyond Guilt Trips, Mindful Travel in an Unequal World. And she said, oh, there you go. Oh my God, I love her book. And she said to me in that comment, she said something like, you need to decolonialize the way you're thinking about this. If you're thinking about success in your book in relation to capitalism and book sales, that's only one way to measure the success of your book. And I just loved that she just like called me out on that, because it really did get me thinking, what is the point of this book? Yes, sales are important. Yes, numbers count. And for sure, a lot of this stuff, the success of your first book helps you with your second book, et cetera, or even getting a book deal, et cetera. But also knowing that people have read this and felt seen, that people have read this and felt empowered to go somewhere that maybe they were on the fence about before, that in many ways has been so much for me. And just knowing that I have filled a gap that I think was really out there. And at the end of the day, as we talked about earlier, this book is it's an evergreen book. It's meant to last. It's not going to be one of those quick grow and also quick fall books. I'm hoping that for years to come, people pick this book up when they're contemplating a trip, and that new generations of travelers experience that too. So I'm in it for the long game. And I think that that's an important thing to remember too, that sometimes really just intentionally growing and reaching people is the best thing that you can do.
Yeah.
So that's where I am.
That's beautiful. That's really beautiful. And I remember we had this conversation about the godmother complex while riding in my car towards your book event.
Yeah,
I just
that's right.
remembered, wait, I heard this before. Where did I hear this
Yeah.
before? And it really resonates with me because I'm exactly the same way. You know, I just really believe, or like, just have to do good work and people will notice. And I think some of it is
Yeah.
also cultural, to be honest, because I grew up in
Yeah.
a culture where speaking about yourself and about your
Yeah.
work was shameful, because it's like, why
Yeah.
are you boasting about yourself? We don't do
Yeah.
that, you know. But here in
Yeah.
America, it's a very different approach. I had to learn how to speak
Yeah.
about myself, you know. So I think
Yeah.
some of it is cultural as well. I love that you said it's a long-term orientation for you. It's a book that's going to shape and touch people for years to come. I'm even thinking about gifting it to my friend's daughter, who is a traveler already,
Yeah.
but she's going to be a solo traveler one day, and I want her to read it as well. So I think that's just really
I love
beautiful.
that. And that's my hope, honestly. And I think that that's probably the biggest compliment you can get as an author is, it's one thing for somebody to pick up your book and that's great. It's a whole other thing for somebody to say, I have gotten so much out of this book that now I want you to read it. And this idea of gifting this book to me is like the most wonderful thing to think about, is somebody saying that this book is giving the words that I don't have, or that I don't have the time to give you. So I'm going to give this to you. And I hope that it helps a lot of people.
So let's talk about AI. I
Oh
know that.
no, Yulia, we
No,
were on
no,
such a positive note. Why are we doing this to ourselves?
because I know that both you and I have some thoughts about it.
Why? Oh God. Yes,
Here's the thing. We don't have to talk about AI because I've already talked to AI about this
that's true.
conversation, asked AI to come up with a question to ask you. Are
Ah!
you ready for this?
Yes, I want to hear it.
All right. Considering your concerns about AI's impact on creators, how do you envision Wanderful integrating AI in a way that enhances human creativity and community without undermining the authenticity and unique voices of individual creators?
Oh my God. Well, you tell me the answer, AI. No, I think so. So here's the thing. I mean, and there's a lot to talk about, many episodes worth of content here to talk about. But the main thing, and I know you get this, Yulia, and I think a lot of people first off don't understand how this all works, like how AI is affecting our travels. And so there's travel content, and then there's like the experience of content creators, and the fact that a lot of what they're doing is being threatened because they're the ones who are creating resources, and then what AI is doing is basically scraping those resources to give answers, and it's not giving credit to the original creator, which is creating that industry. But the other thing that's happening is that AI is now also taking quick answers and delivering those same answers to large groups of people. So if you were to Google what's the best thing to do in Paris, we're all going to get sort of the same answer of like, go to the Eiffel Tower or whatever. And it affects how we travel, right? Even more so, they used to say in order to travel most impactfully, get off the first page of Google. Now it's like there's not even a first page of Google anymore. It's literally just like,
Just
here's
the
the
first,
answer.
yeah.
Go. Yeah. And it hurts travel in a lot of ways to, number one, only recommend one place because it ends up in like overpopulation, overcrowding, and over tourism. But then also the fact that everybody is endlessly different and diverse and unique. And to think that we all would have the same answer to a question is not real. And some of this is AI is going to get better and better at it, right? It's going to be like, based on you, Beth Santos, and what you love about travel, here are our recommendations. So it's going to change. I think it's very easy to be very doom and gloom about AI, and to kind of say, at least from the creator side, to kind of say, oh, this is the end of the creator industry as we know it, and our businesses are going to fail. That is not untrue. But I also feel like, having been in this industry now for over 10 years and seeing how it's evolved, these new technologies are always going to be coming. Like, no one's going to stop AI. It's not going to happen. Sorry, everyone. Maybe there will be some laws implemented, but the development of AI is not going to stop. It's going to continue. And so the question is, thank you, Mr. AI or Ms. AI, who thought of this question, is like, okay, well, how do we integrate this? And I think for Wanderful, it comes in two ways. You know, the first is using AI for what it's good at. Fast answers, many answers at once, being able to answer those quick questions of like, should I do for dinner? Where should I go? What's the best rated, whatever. Yes, AI can be helpful with that. There are some adjustments that need to be made, like we need to make sure we're citing our sources, et cetera. So it can be like a way to sort of maybe drive traffic to some of these websites. And actually, in some ways, it's kind of exciting from a creator side, because the very early roots of Wanderful, when we first started blogging, it was literally just like stories. It was just what it felt like to be a woman experiencing the world and the day-to-day life of that. And some of them felt like very diary entry like, but then as online writing evolved, it did become more oriented towards search. We did things like search engine optimization, where you would plug in keywords and you would think about, okay, how do we make this like very easily readable and scannable and digestible? And how can we give quick tips? And have listicles. And so I actually think there is a really neat opportunity here to no longer have to subscribe to that, which I think is scary for some people because they didn't even exist before that happened. Like they didn't even have their blogs before that existed. I feel like an old lady grandma being like, I remember a time, when we hardly even thought about what the search engines were going to be searching for. And the stories we told were just interesting stories. They were just human interest stories, like with good writing. And I think that is one thing that AI will never be able to perfect, is being human, because an AI is not human. And so that is the direction that we're really focusing on, is what are these human interest stories that, no, maybe they're not giving you like the top 5 things to pack on your next trip, because AI can probably do that for you. But it's talking about what it feels to be you, or what it feels to have learned the lessons that you've learned, and what people can take away from that. And I think that in some ways, I hope that some really beautiful travel writing is going to come out of that, because we're not putting so much pressure on ourselves to be searchable. Now, how will people find us? That's a whole other question, but I think that there's pros and cons for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel the same way as you, and we talked about this a bit offline as well. So, and I think what it also is highlighting for me, this whole AI craze. AI is just a technology, right? It's a
Mm-hmm.
tool. I think what's been really scary for me is not necessarily the AI itself, but it's how very, very, very few companies have so much power to dramatically alter our everyday reality and how we show up, how we create,
Yeah.
how we are found, how
Yep.
we create revenue and income and livelihood for ourselves.
Yep.
That has been just really scary for me to, and
Yeah.
it's not a new thing, of course. It's already been going on for
Yeah.
years, but it just really crystallizes it. I played around with ChatGPT a little bit more, and I asked it to answer this question if ChatGPT were Beth Santos. Do you want to hear that?
Yes. Yes, I do.
Okay, so that same question that I asked you, which was created by ChatGPT, I asked ChatGPT to answer as if ChatGPT was Beth Santos. So here we go. If I
Okay.
were Beth Santos, I might answer like this: AI holds great potential for enhancing our community while preserving the unique voices of our creators. At Wanderful, we could use AI to personalize content and recommendations to our members, ensuring they receive the most relevant and inspiring travel stories. We can also automate routine tasks like moderating forums or handling customer service inquiries, giving our creators more time to focus on crafting their narratives. Importantly, we would use AI as a tool to amplify human creativity, not replace it. It goes into more and more detail, but I just want to say, I think
That's
even in
awesome.
this little snippet that I just read you and your actual answer, therein lies the difference between humans and machines, because your answer was alive, if I may say.
Mm,
And this
yeah.
answer, to me at least, reads like copy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
You're absolutely right. It was like a perfect answer, one that you would be thinking a lot about and like editing a lot, versus, yeah, mine, which is kind of like by the seat of my pants, like as a human would answer something, which is
yeah.
imperfect, but like in its own way. But that's fascinating. I think that's really, really interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's wild. It's a wild question. It's a wild world. I think there's a lot of fear. I think there is a lot of opportunity if we can harness it. But at the end of the day, it does mean that creators are going to have to rethink. And you said, which stuck with me, which was, we have been told to build businesses that are stable. Like every entrepreneur is told, make sure you're not basing your business on somebody else's algorithm, right? Instagram is a good example. We say, get off of Instagram, build your own email list, build your own blog, whatever. And up until this point, I think we all, or at least I did, sort of assumed that like blog content was safe, that it wasn't really relying on somebody else's algorithm. And I'm sure a lot of people who maybe like work in search are like, oh, I knew all the time, it's completely algorithmic. But it's not like Google was always changing the algorithm like some of these social media sites are, where it's like a daily occurrence and you're kind of trying to chase it. It always felt a little bit more stable. And so then you start asking these questions. Well, what is actually a stable place? Okay, we say build an email list. Well, technically, I don't know what happens if like the way email marketing works or the way your Gmail inbox collects email, if they change that, and that's happened before too, where like now you have to say, oh, add my contact as a contact because otherwise it might go into spam. I mean, now with the way digital is, there isn't really like one completely safe way to build your business. It's kind of just about diversifying and pivoting with the times and knowing that these things are going to change and being able to change with them.
And returning back to sitting around a fire in a cave, I think that's where we're going to end up with.
Yes. Telling stories, word of mouth, full on word of mouth storytelling. Let's do it.
I'd want to be in a cave with you, Beth, sitting around a fire.
I would totally be in a cave with you, especially if we had marshmallows and s'more supplies.
Wanderful is 11 years old this year. Congratulations. You just celebrated its birthday recently. And I remember coming to your first WITS in Chicago in 2014. I don't know if I told you this before, but I was still in corporate. I still like had no idea what I'm doing, but I remember vividly coming to that first WITS.
Wow.
And
Wow.
It's just incredible like to see how the community has grown and evolved and just has become such a beautiful thing. And by the way, congrats on opening a chapter in Lebanon as well, which is awesome. And I feel like at its core, what you're doing with Wanderful, what you're doing with your book, with the podcast, with everything, with how you're showing up in the world, is that you are building a world where every one of us can show up as however they want to show up, create whatever they want to create, and really just be the best version or the most truest version of themselves. And I think that's just such a beautiful, beautiful vision and beautiful mission even to be at. And you've done a lot of work in that realm. But I have two questions for you. One, where do you feel like we still need to do a lot of progress? Because I feel like on the individual level, we are all becoming more and more emboldened. We have community support, but sometimes for me, at least, it feels like it's still not enough. It still feels like these systems are working so much against us. So I'm curious to kind of hear your reflection on that. Like, where's there's still big gaps that you see? And then where do you see that it has changed for the better in this 11 years?
I think the answer is kind of the same, actually. When I first started in this space, we didn't have any of these like communities that we have now. There's the Black Travel Alliance now. There's Native Women's Wilderness. There's creators that have built whole, audiences and whole communities. Caterina Rivera has trips that she does for disabled travelers. None of that stuff existed, at least not so much. And that representation was almost non-existent, even though those people existed. And it has been so heartening to see all of these communities come out that really help people feel seen and heard and celebrated and understood. I think that they are still very niche, which kind of goes back to our original conversation of these things are so pervasive but treated like they're so niche. And I think that is still a real problem. I think, and even if you look at it from the perspective of something very measurable, which is like tourism spending, I think in 2020 there was a lot of dedication to DEI, and with the BLM movement, it was like, okay, now we're going to invest much more in like Black travelers and BIPOC people. And it was like all of this energy, and then almost just as fast, I think it was lost. And DEI, I've heard about a lot of DEI departments being almost, if everything but disbanded, pretty much being one person again, kind of in a silo somewhere. And my opinion is that these DEI offices need to be pervasive. They need to be cross-departmental. It needs to be infiltrating marketing and operations. And funding and, and not just like its own little department that's kind of just contributing one voice at the table. It needs to be the entire table. And I don't think that we are anywhere near there yet, where we're really thoughtfully considering the needs of a diversity of travelers, of many different types of travelers, which is a big loss for our tourism industry. So I think we've gotten farther. I'm happy that we've gotten somewhere. I think we still have many, many more things to do in order to get to a point where everyone does feel fully celebrated and that tourism can grow to its potential.
Well said. Well said. We still have our work cut out for us, but that's the
We sure
journey,
do.
right? So what are you most excited about in your life right now?
There's actually like so much that I'm excited about. It's kind of crazy, but one thing is I had this idea of a TV show last year before I knew I was pregnant. The idea was, we've talked about how most travel TV hosts are like old white men, and how there's really a lack of travel hosts that are not that, but also travel stories that are really showcasing women.
Yeah.
And so I created this concept called World Herstory. And we actually filmed an episode in Puerto Rico last year. I was pregnant and didn't know it. And I love how it's turned out. I actually really love it. And I've been talking about getting it onto public television. So we're currently like fundraising so that we can film a full season and then pitch it to public TV. It's really exciting. So we're like actively looking for individuals and companies that want to get involved, that want to kind of help see this show take foot, see better representation, and showcasing women's stories in travel and women of now. I think even though it's World Herstory, it's not about the women of the past. It's about women who are defining history right now, who are making places what they are now, the entrepreneurs, the change makers, the women who work in tourism, the women who are defining cultures as they are and telling their stories. And it's been really fun. And I've been really enjoying it. It's absolutely terrifying because there's so much I don't know. But at the same time, it's a really exciting part of that journey. So that's my current project.
I love that. I love that so much. And we'll link to it in the show notes too, so our listeners can check it out and learn more about it. And finally, which place are you going to next?
I'm going to, oh God, where am I going? Oh, I'm going to New Orleans for 2 weeks, which will be fun. I leave on Wednesday. I leave in like a few days. Yeah, I can't wait.
Amazing. I've never been. I hear so much amazing things about New Orleans.
You have to come. I'm going to have beignets every day. And it's going to be like 95 degrees and 100% humidity. And I can't wait. We're going to have so much fun. Me and 3 kids on a plane solo. Wish me luck.
If anyone can do it, it's you, Beth, honestly. Beth, it was so wonderful to chat with you. I wish we had more time, but for today, this was so inspiring and uplifting and really beautiful as always. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Yulia. It was a pleasure.